Hi, everybody. Great to see some people that I know in this room and also some people that I don't know. Welcome. As Emily mentioned, I hold two roles here. I direct the farm program at Duke, and I'm also a professor in the Franklin Humanities Institute. And partly I'm here because I'm also here with my lovely co-chair. We're heading up the Food and Sustainability Subcommittee for the Healthy Duke campaign, and we're soliciting your ideas, so please be in touch with those as well. So we grow, I'm just going to give you some stats first. So the Duke Campus Farm, for those of you who didn't know we even had a farm, we're a 1-acre working farm. We're owned and operated by Duke University. We use all organic practices. We're 7 miles from campus, directly across from the Carolina Friends School, or just out past the Leamer Center, if you know where that is. 3 full-time staff members, a 12-member student farm crew. We grew just over 12,000 pounds of produce, tons of produce, 12,000 plus pounds of produce. That's a little over 6 tons. Most of which goes to Duke Dining. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. 70 households are members of our community-supported agriculture program. We get about 1,500 visitors a year to our site. So we grow some pretty beautiful food at our farm. I'm proud of what we grow, and I think our students are proud too. I think that growing food, a little bit like growing old or maybe falling in love, right? It's something that is really deeply human. Growing food can put us in touch with those things. It reminds us of what it means to be alive in this world. So that's an experience that's both immediately accessible and also very, very distant for most Duke students. And in fact, for most people living in the United States, this is the case. So part of our job at the Duke Campus Farm is to offer folks the opportunity to participate in this process through hands-on work at the farm, through mentored experiential learning with our student crew, and through things like co-curricular workshops, alternative break programs, and increasingly through course collaborations and course offerings. So obviously, most Duke students will not go on to be farmers. And much as I love to grow food, this is a means rather than an end to us. So we use work on the farm and the questions it raises, including questions like, why the heck does Duke even have a farm, as a way to inspire students to get involved with the food system, and ideally to make positive change within it. So sustainable agriculture obviously presents recognizable benefits in terms of increased environmental literacy, increased food literacy, but there are other ways that students on campus can be obtaining that experience. And obviously we're not a campus with an agricultural department or an agriculture major, but probably if you're in this room, you understand that the food system that we have right now, the system that we're all currently and constantly participating in, presents some of the most daunting challenges for this generation. So when we think about it that way, we can't really afford any longer to sequester all thinking about something as important as agriculture and food systems to land-grant universities, right? They can't have the monopoly on what it is to think about food, especially because land-grant universities are focused primarily on food production, right? Which is really only one piece of a really complex puzzle, which involves, when we think about the food system more broadly speaking, right, it involves so many problems that we're tackling in all corners, right? Things like antibiotic resistance, things like the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, type 2 diabetes epidemics, black land loss. Right, these are all things that we need to think about when we're thinking about and with the food system. Agriculture is about so much more than just making food. And now all of those problems that I just mentioned and so many more that I didn't, right, they're all falling under the umbrella of climate change. When we think about agriculture from that perspective, it's a very vulnerable sector. On the one hand, farmers and all of us who eat, right, we're some of the people that are being most affected by volatility in climate. On the other hand, farmers and people who eat are also some of the people that are creating the most greenhouse gas emissions, right? The agricultural sector and all the things associated currently are the number, either depending on who you believe, either the number 2 or the number 3 contributor in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, which lead to climate change. So luckily for us at the Duke Campus Farm, we're in the middle of a pretty unprecedented public conversation around food. Most of you in this room have probably heard about people like Michael Pollan, Jonathan Safran Foer. I know his book was the First Year Reads book a few years ago, folks like Will Allen. And a lot of students come to this campus with an inkling of this kind of public conversation about the food movement. But this conversation in that context revolves most around personal dietary choice. And of course, personal dietary choice is important, but we also need to find ways to scale up change, right? To be looking not just at market structures, but also at political and cultural structures that govern our assumptions about things like who should be farming, who will be farming, right? Seeing as the average age of a farmer in this country is about 68. What kinds of systems is farming embedded within? So environmental systems, but also things like public health, right? Farming is really at the heart of a lot of the schisms that we're starting to see in this most recent elections, divides between black and white, essentially between white people and people of color, between rural and urban, right? The work that we do in farming really is seated right at the heart of those problems. So we're here to grow food, but we're here mostly to grow the conversation around land-based learning, experiential learning, and critical food studies at Duke. The campus farm movement, believe it or not, just turned 20. So that's almost as old as our graduating seniors. And we're ready to evolve, right? And I think that we're well positioned here at Duke to be at the leading edge of this, in part because we have such great partners at Duke Dining, and we're so happy for Marcus's arrival to be kind of pushing that envelope and moving that ball forward. Also because of the arrival of the World Food Policy Center. Maybe some of you heard Dean Kelly Brunell speak earlier this week about that. And because of a lot of the great faculty, students, and staff we have that are starting to get really enthusiastic about thinking about this harder. So our goal is not just to show the value of the kind of immersiveness and critical thinking that small-scale farming really demands, but also to take it one step further and use this kind of platform for change to create students, not just to understand where their food comes from, right? Or even as broadly food literate citizens who understand how their choices impact broader environmental, social, or economic systems, but also as students who understand the kind of work that needs to be done to change the system that we currently have. And that students that are motivated to drive those changes on structural as well as personal levels. So I hope I've given you some new ways to think about what a farm could be and mean at Duke. You're very welcome to come and see for yourself. I have some flyers that I was going to give you. There are a bunch of different ways that you can get involved with us, starting with just eating our food. It's available primarily at the marketplace. In the current moment, Friday is also the last day to sign up for our community-supported agriculture program. So that's a program where eaters can get connected to the farmers that are feeding them. They become shareholders in what it is that we do, so they're investing in us, in our land stewardship, in our educational programming. They're kind of investing in the next generation of food systems change agents. They stay with us through the course of the whole season, so that's also a really great way for us to get to know them. You can join us for a work day. Our farm gates are open on Thursdays and Sundays from 3 to 5. You don't need to sign up. You can just show up, get dirty with us. You can also come to our Contra Dance, which is one of the funnest things I think that we do. It's usually a couple hundred students actually who all come out to the farm at a beautiful time of day. It's sunset, it's harvest time. You don't need any experience or a partner. It's a ton of fun. And we're also having an alternative fall break program coming up in about a month, where it's basically a sustainable ag boot camp over 2 days, where students are going to be learning some of the fundamental skills needed to start or keep running a market garden or urban homestead where you're at. We also have classes. I'm teaching a class currently called the Environment and Literature, Law, and Science. All that stuff is up on our website.
But so like Emily said, I'm the sustainability manager for Duke Dining, and this is a new position. I've been at Duke for just over a year now. But Duke Dining has been focused on sustainability I think it goes back maybe 2 or 3 years. The work has been kind of culminating in the creation of this position. So before I kind of really dive in, I want to make sure that we kind of set a couple of baseline things, just make sure we're all speaking the same language. So the first is this word sustainability. What are some of the things? Well, first of all, if anybody knows like a formal definition of sustainability, go ahead and let me know. Or like, what are some other words that like folks associate with the word sustainability? Green. What else? Future generations. What else? Renewable. Any others?
Carbon footprint.
Okay, cool. So the reason I kind of like to go through this exercise is sustainability is kind of like this really amorphous word that is thrown around and is applied in a lot of different ways. And these are some great examples of sustainability adjacent issues. But just to give like a quick 101, there are 3 kind of formal definitions of sustainability that I tend to look at. So one is the Brundtland Commission. And so this was a definition that was developed by the United Nations. It's a group of world leaders got together called the Brundtland Commission. And this is, they defined sustainability as the ability to meet the needs of current generations without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs, if that makes sense. Another one is called the triple bottom line. You'll hear this a lot kind of in a business context. And that's this idea that if something is environmentally sustainable, economically sustainable, and socially sustainable, then if it meets all those criteria, then it's something that is truly sustainable. It can truly kind of go on for the long term. So when you get into questions of social equity, environmental issues, the economics of these sorts of things. So that is what when they refer to the triple bottom line, they're talking about that economic, social, and environmental, those 3 pieces, and how they kind of play off each other. The third one that I think somebody tell me if I'm spelling Iroquois wrong. OIS. I've been told this is considered the law of the Iroquois. I've not looked this up, so I apologize if this is incorrect. But in every deliberation, consider the impact on the 7th generation. It's kind of this idea of like thinking forward. So that's another kind of idea of sustainability that I think is really interesting. So that's kind of just like, so we kind of, when you think about sustainability manager, it's kind of thinking about this idea of how what we're doing now can be carried forward and the impact as it's carried forward. So just kind of, so we've got that. The Duke Dining piece of that. When you think about the footprint of Duke Dining, there are 35 dining locations on campus. 3 of those are what we call residential locations. And that means, or self-operated locations, that means they are run directly by Duke Dining. They're run by Duke University. They're Duke University employees. We set very clear policies for them. Those are Duke University locations, and that includes Marketplace, which is on the East Campus. It's a primary dining hall for first-year students. Trinity Cafe, which is a cafe in the basement of Marketplace, and the Freeman Center for Jewish Life. There's an all-you-care-to-eat dining location in there. So those are our 3 residential dining locations. The other 32 are third-party contractors. And so one of the things I think is really interesting about Duke Dining's footprint is, of those 32 contractors, we've got the full scale of restaurateurs. So we've got like major chains like McDonald's, Panda Express, those kind of folks. We've got folks who have franchises throughout the Triangle area, so Saladelia being an example of that. We've got folks who have 1 or 2 restaurants in the area, and then we've got folks who only run dining locations on Duke's campus. So it kind of covers the full scale of kind of the restaurant industry all on Duke's campus, which I think is interesting when you think about it from a sustainability perspective. The reason I like to go over this, so this doesn't include anything in the hospital. This is only university locations. The reason I like to go through this is so that folks understand when I kind of lay out this sustainability program that we have, they are applied very directly and very intentionally for these residential locations, because those are Duke Dining locations. We have set a kind of a baseline, which I may have some time to get into for these third-party contractors, but it is not quite as stringent as for the standards that we have for ourselves, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's kind of just like setting the stage. The first kind of question that I like to pose when we have this conversation is let's see if this works. Is this question, if anybody's read the Michael Pollan essay, is this question of why bother? And Saskia went over kind of some of the broad themes, but when you think about issues related to food and sustainability, when you think about issues related to the food system, what are some that come to mind? So what are like the big problems? And you can be as broad or specific as you'd like.
One problem I'd say is the fact that like fast and unhealthy food's a lot cheaper than things like vegetables at the grocery store.
Yeah, so like nutrition. Okay.
Farmer and worker rights.
Yeah, it's like fairness. What else?
Issues with like food deserts and poor food.
Yeah. I'm going to put that under fairness, but we'll say social equity. Environmental impact, so that's things like, well, we'll keep it kind of broad. I'm going to say environmental stewardship. What else? Think about like the different types of food we eat. So maybe animal welfare. Let's say, and then we've got economic issues. So this is, as it relates specifically to Duke Dining and our kind of sustainability mission, we have an invested interest in supporting the local economy and supporting the local food system. And we understand that we have a kind of an institutional power to inject resources into the community. So this kind of gets at, supporting the small and medium-sized businesses, supporting the small and medium-sized farms, that kind of idea. Okay, so this gets at that why bother question. So these are some of the big themes that I consider when I'm going through our sustainability program. And so kind of what I want to do now is map out the food system on Duke's campus. So this is generally where I like to start. These are like the broad principles that we've established for the food that we want to purchase. So I'm gonna just add a couple of things here. So this would be like local, environmental stewardship. That's when you think about things like organic, fairness, nutrition, animal welfare. I think that covers all of our big sustainability principles. Fisheries, that's a big one. Seafood. And you can, and something that just kind of an aside, when you think about studying food and sustainability, you can really dive into any of these topics and just kind of get lost in it. There's so much, there are layers to this stuff. So we've got these principles that we've established. And then we think about suppliers or growers. The question becomes, the question that I have to consider in my position is, how do I identify suppliers and growers that can provide food for Duke's campus at a volume that makes sense and at a price point that makes sense? So that's kind of the challenge there. I'll keep it there for now. After that, when you think about the supply chain of food on campus, when you think about kind of step by step, what would you think comes next? We've got principles that we've established, where we get the food from. What comes after that?
Who prepares the food?
Food preparation. So something that's really interesting that's going on around this is this idea of climate healthy menus, which essentially is this idea of getting animal proteins out of the center of the plate or out of the plate altogether. Just because animal agriculture is very, very resource intensive. There's all sorts of ethical issues kind of surrounding it. So there's this, so that is kind of, when I think about how food is prepared, that's kind of one of the really big themes when you think about how does that relate directly to sustainability. Does that make sense? Okay. What would we think is next? Consumption. I didn't plan on putting that one in there, but I'm glad you did. You suggested that because something that I have to think about in my position is every time we have somebody come to one of our dining locations, whether it's residential or, we call these retail locations, residential or retail location, it's kind of like a little mini classroom. It's an opportunity to educate that person on where their food comes from. And there are a lot of situations where they're not really interested in learning about where their food came from. They just kind of want to eat their meal and go on with their day. So how do you strategically use that as an opportunity to close the gap between this and this? And talk about layers. Like, I mean, as far as like the big food industry, the big food system goes, we've worked very, very hard to separate these two parts of the food system. So how can we, a lot of what I try and do, especially around here, is how do I close this gap? How's that, like, there are educational opportunities, that kind of thing. So then after you eat it, we don't call it throwing away, we call it food recovery. So with this, as it relates specifically to Duke Dining, all Duke Dining locations, retail and residential, compost back of the house. In this building and in Marketplace and in Divinity Cafe, they do what's called post-consumer composting. So the organic waste that you have left over after your meal is composted. We also work with a student organization called the Food Recovery Network at Marketplace, where they come twice a week and they pick up leftover food that has not been served to take it to shelters to feed hungry people. So there's this, the EPA has something called the food recovery hierarchy, which is kind of interesting. So the first is you feed hungry people, then you feed animals. Anybody knows this, and I'm skipping something, let me know. Waste to energy, so it comes after that. Then composting, and then the landfill. So it's actually like composting is pretty low on the list, but that's when people think of food waste, that's kind of immediately where their mind goes. So that's some of the work that we're doing around food recovery. So this is the food system on Duke's campus, kind of hyper condensed. And so with that in mind, I wanted to to quickly just give you a glimpse of Duke's roadmap for becoming, Duke Dining's roadmap for becoming really the most sustainable dining program in the country. So what we're working on is, if I can figure out how to just kind of write this. What we're working on is we've got these different food categories. So you've got beef, pork, chicken, turkey, fish, eggs, milk, produce, and coffee. So these are kind of like the broadest categories of food that we purchase and serve on campus. And so what we're doing is we are actually setting different priorities, sustainability-oriented priorities for each of these food categories that we pull from this list of principles. Does that make sense? So like for all of our animal proteins, our first priority relates to nutrition and customer health. So our priority 1 is identifying animal proteins that have never been treated with antibiotics or hormones. After that, we talk about this animal welfare piece. So we look to purchase foods that are certified humanely raised. With produce, our priority 1 is local, and Duke Dining defines local as 250 miles or the state of North Carolina. Where also you'll see some schools will consider things like Coca-Cola. Like if there's a bottling plant nearby, they'll call that local. We're very intentional about not considering those sorts of things local. Texas Pete is something that a lot of North Carolina schools like to call local.
What about like Smithfield Port?
It's a very good question. So yes, but local is our third priority. So as far as animal protein goes. So what that means is if they're trying to sell us a product that is pumped full of antibiotics and hormones, is not humanely raised at all, and is local, that's pretty baseline, especially in North Carolina. So that's not, we don't kind of pump that into our sustainability program. We're not trying to greenwash around that. That's a good question because that comes up a lot. We get a lot of salespeople like, it's local. Like, can I see the farm? Well, no. Well, no thanks. So that kind of gives you, this is our roadmap. And this is pretty innovative in that there aren't a lot of schools that are kind of drilling down at this level. And so what I can do is I know what percentage of our purchases for these residential locations, this isn't campus-wide, but what percentage of our purchases, of beef purchases, were raised without antibiotics or hormones. And I can do that for each, so if you've got like your columns here, I can do that for each of these categories. And we've established goals for these things.
What's the hierarchy for produce and dairy?
For produce, it's local first and then organic or organic practice. For dairy, it's cows not treated with synthetic hormones, humanely raised, local, and then organic. We don't. So in calculating those numbers, when I'm thinking about like, so you've got the numerator of products that are antibiotic and hormone free, in that denominator, like processed beef products would go in that denominator. So things like that make it so it probably will never hit 100% if we're offering a lot of processed meat products. But it's not a separate category.
Yeah, I'm thinking even about like processed convenience foods. You know,
Yeah.
you choose more sustainable options for like
Yeah.
chips. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question.
The consumption of those must be really high.
Right, and that is not actually something that is in the plan at the moment, but that definitely makes sense. That it is something that could be considered. And this is all very fluid. This is a constant work in progress as these kind of different things come up. So that's kind of the roadmap. And then just to finish off, I wanted to give you all a sense of where we stand today. This past year was our baseline setting year. It was the first year I had access to all this data. So which reminds me, if anybody's interested in working in sustainability, kind of on this desk job level, data analysis is a really important skill to have. Systems thinking is a really important skill to have. Just a couple of things to consider. So this past year was baseline setting year. With that in mind, so this is where we stand as of today, and now we're going to set goals based on these kind of baseline numbers. So as of today, let's do this in red. 31% of the animal proteins that we purchased of these categories are antibiotic and hormone free. 20% is local.
For meat.
What's that?
For meat.
This is a roll up. So this includes any of these categories where local is a priority is included in this number. So it includes all of the animal proteins. We actually get a decent amount of local catfish from North Carolina suppliers, eggs, milk, produce, and we look at locally roasted, but that number is not rolled up into this. 27% of our seafood was MSC certified on Seafood Watch's Best Choices or Good Alternatives list or local. So those are we consider that broad category of more sustainably fished seafood. Animal welfare. We currently are not purchasing any animal proteins that are certified humanely raised. So that is going to be a big focus over the next several years. That's an interesting challenge when it comes to volume and price. Especially with chicken is an interesting kind of an issue. A lot of these, and so a whole other kind of part of this is third-party certifications. So you've got true third-party certifications that are unbiased, but a lot of industries, all of these industries, have their own animal welfare certifications. So you kind of got to navigate through that too. 5% of the food that we purchased was organic. And 29% of the coffee that we purchased was certified fair trade. We've recently, Joe Van Gogh will be our primary coffee supplier at our residential locations now, so that number is automatically going to move up to 100%.
And this is in terms of dollars?
This is in terms of dollars spent. So 31% of the money that we spent on animal proteins was for animal proteins that were never treated with antibiotics or hormones. No, go ahead.
How do those numbers compare to other similar universities?
Yeah. So that is something else that's really interesting is it's hard to know because there's not a lot of transparency. If you go to, really, and actually I have some of the numbers here because I went through this. I may have left it in my office. Nope, right here. Like I looked at a lot of our peer institutions to kind of see where they sat when I was trying to figure out what our goals would be. But they just kind of throw out numbers and they don't talk about what's in those numbers. So like they'll say 50% local, but are you considering Coke local? So it's really difficult to do the apples to apples. Something that a lot of campuses do is the Real Food Challenge, and they set standards that kind of roll up all of this stuff and call it real food. But there are some schools do it, other schools don't do it. So it's difficult to measure across. But what I wanted to really kind of in summary, what I wanted to really get at is like the why bother question or the why bother question. These are the standards that Duke Dining has set. This is kind of the food system on campus, and this is our roadmap for kind of moving things forward. It's kind of like the big picture. All of this information, I'm working on getting this report together, so these numbers aren't online, but this whole plan and fleshed out a lot more is available online if you want to take a look at it. Like why these topics are important to us, kind of all that information fleshed out is all available online too.